Hello, and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. After months of what seemed to be a stalled, if not utterly failing Trump effort to end the Ukraine war, developments on this front have been hurtling at a breakneck speed this week. As of Tuesday, there was still an expectation that the president might be able to announce something big as America's turkeys and pumpkin pies were landing on groaning holiday tables this Thursday. To say there is a lot to do before such an event could take place is an understatement. First, the backlash against Trump's 28-point peace plan has been swift and vitriolic. Remember, the forces lined up to reject any plan that offers Russia concessions are at the levers of legacy mainstream media and in concert with Congressional megaphones, and both are already promoting a narrative of appeasement and capitulation. For many Americans, this is the only message that they are receiving from ongoing negotiations this week in the media. Nevertheless, the 28-point plan has already shrunk to a 19-point plan after the Trump team met with Ukrainians in Geneva on Monday. Trump officials, including fresh envoy Secretary of Army Dan Driscoll, have been meeting with Russians too, trying to gauge what measures in either plan that they will ultimately agree to. It is a fluid and fraught, and social media is covering it minute to minute. So gossip, scoops, fake news, and spin are all on the menu. Here to discuss all of this are two of the best analysts on the war and the potential end to it, Mark Episcopos and Mike Vlahos. Mark is a colleague of mine at Quincy, where he is a research associate in our Eurasia program, and Mike is a retired professor of military strategy and history and author of Fighting Identity, Sacred War, and World Change. Thank you both for joining me on the show today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're here. And like I said, we have a ton to talk about. So I wanted to ask you both each this starting question. Are forces allied towards killing the deal? And is it deliberate? I'm going to start with you, Mark.
Well, you know, Kelly, I was stunned at the avalanche of misinformation, malinformation, whatever you want to call it, directed at this deal shortly after its contents were revealed, and so much of it just has no bearing in reality. If you look at what people are saying about it, that it's some kind of a capitulation ultimatum, that it's a diktat to surrender Ukraine to Putin. And then if you actually, look at the document and look at its provisions, would Putin be interested in giving Ukraine a 600,000 man peacetime standing army? Would he be interested in giving Ukraine Article 5 style security guarantees from the United States? Would he be interested in Ukraine withdrawing from this remainder of a contested region called Donetsk, but instead of Russia taking over, it being turned into a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, instead of Russia simply seizing control? So none of this makes any sense. And by the way, you have the European Union. Ukraine has a guaranteed path to the European Union, which would guarantee that it would be a Western-aligned state, firmly anchored in Euro-Atlantic institutions, aside from NATO, which is one of the big sticking points. But if you look at this deal, none of it comports with the reality of the charges being leveled against it. And that's been really jarring to see. And you do have to ask at some point whether or not there is a really cynical and I think unfortunate attempt to portray it in a certain way in order to make it toxic.
Yeah, Mike, Eldar Mammadov, who's written about this, I think he is more likely to agree that this is a cynical, deliberate attempt to kill the deal so that the Europeans can encourage the long war, continue fighting, maybe use this time to rearm Ukraine. What are your thoughts on the forces that are so intent on seeing this deal either be so watered down as to the Russians not agreeing to it, or just killed in the crib?
The first part of your question addressed the interior networking that might or might not exist. And so there are several data points, we might call them, things that we know from the past both the recent past and the first term of the Trump administration. And there will, not only are there different camps within the administration, different factions, obviously, as true of any imperial court, but also the ease of networking has advanced to such a point that people can put together a plan. You saw that as far back as the 9/11 war with the message force multipliers and the way in which the Bush administration was able to orchestrate a united message. So the groups that oppose this, both within the US and within Europe, not to mention even Ukraine, I'm sure have coordinated. And yet, the big question is, what are their objectives in opposing an agreement that would end the agony, not just for Ukraine, but also for Europe? And this is still somewhat mysterious to me, in the sense that what happens in the future if there is no agreement will make the defeat that Ukraine suffers, and by extension, all of NATO, much worse, much more shameful because of the devastation and hollowing out of the nation of Ukraine. But also, it will be a defeat that could easily be the death knell of the alliance itself. And so I don't understand why people in Europe wouldn't want to take a deal now. And this is this perplexity is compounded by the fact that the Europeans have already created a counter narrative. Their first narrative was, of course, that Ukraine would win. That was guaranteed. Russia was backward, primitive, hollowed out itself as a military, couldn't hack it. Well, that disappeared, and then the long, hard slog replaced it. And that isn't sustainable because of the collapsing lines at the front and the fact that Ukraine is running out of soldiers. So the new narrative, which is shaky, but it's being put forth, is that it's a qualified victory for Ukraine strategically because this heroic, plucky nation survived the worst that Russia could throw at it, and is now essentially legitimated in a way that it never was as an independent country, and that this is a real achievement. And NATO, by standing fast with Ukraine, has created the basis for a united front during the long twilight struggle ahead in the new Cold War. I don't know why Europe simply doesn't go with that, because things are going to be much, much worse for Europe. So I have an idea, but I'm curious what Mark thinks about all this.
Well, I mean, I think I'm getting from you that Ukraine could rest on a few laurels. I mean, it actually beat back Russia from taking more territory than it had wanted or intended to from the beginning. But the longer it waits, the more it is destroyed and won't have any laurels to rest on. It could actually declare, as Anatol Lieven has said himself, it could
Right.
actually declare victory right now, in a
Well,
sense.
the big problem with that, and this is something that will come as a shock to Western electorates, is that the reality of the war in terms of what it hath wrought in Ukrainian society is far worse than anyone has let on. And so you can declare a victory, but this hollow shell of a devastated nation, which is approximately half the size of the population it went to war with back in 22, that has lost over 1 million, perhaps even as much as 1.5 million dead. And Russia has lost far fewer. I mean, the latest Media Zona correlation of obituaries for Russian casualties puts the KIA for Russia at this point at about 145,000. And you can do the math very quickly. And it doesn't look very good that we suborned Ukraine into a war that completely ruined it. And this will hang like an albatross around the necks of the European elites in future, and only make the defeat worse, because it wasn't simply a defeat, but it it ushered in so much misery and tragedy in its wake.
Yeah. Mark, let's talk a little bit about Russia because the mainstream media in the West likes to tell us what Russia is going to do, what Russia is thinking, what Putin is, what his designs are and his desires. But can we get a sense from you? What do you think Russia would be willing to concede in whatever becomes the 19, 20, 29-point plan? And can you explain why? Because I think it's important to understand where they might fall on all this. And I understand that the media wants to call it a capitulation and that everything's a gift to Russia, but it seems to me that there are some concessions by Russia, and there might be some to come, depending on these negotiations and how they run.
Yeah, and to your point, Kelly, I mean, the very idea that Russia would agree to a 600,000 standing army post-war was itself treated by many of us as surprising, and something that it's not at all clear that Russia would agree to something like that. So even that original 28-point plan had some clear provisions that spoke to Russia's serious willingness to entertain compromises in order for the war to be ended on terms that Russia would accept. So I think the Russians have a lot more flexibility than many people would be led to believe. Even on a core issue like the territorial question, the common wisdom has always been that Russia will accept nothing short of Ukraine's withdrawal from the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine, which is the main source of dispute right now on the territorial issues that are outstanding as part of a peace deal. But the Russians have sent signals over the past several weeks that they care about the territorial question, but they also care about a lot of other things, including the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine, the issue of NATO expansion, the issue of the architecture of European security that the Russians have spoken a lot about, and goes to the core objectives that Russia has tried to achieve over the course of the invasion since 2022. And I get the sense, and of course, this may very well turn out to be completely not true in another day or so as we get more clarity on what Russia's red lines are. I get the sense that if Russia approves of the other parts of this deal, and we are dealing with a very complex package of economic, diplomatic, security, territorial issues that are all being bundled together. But if Russia is favorably inclined to the other parts of this deal, particularly on the question of NATO expansion, especially if they can get a guarantee against not just Ukrainian NATO membership, but eastward NATO expansion, which would cover the whole post-Soviet space, I don't see why they would necessarily be opposed to some kind of a ceasefire along the lines of contact, and whenever that ceasefire occurs. I think that is very well can be on the cards. That is something that, of course, U.S. negotiators will have to probe. As I understand, there was a discussion today between U.S. officials and Russian officials in Abu Dhabi about what the terms of this could be. But I think that we have a lot of cards to play in introducing sweeteners in certain areas that would lead Russia to potentially make concessions in other areas. But that's the tricky nature of this kind of linkage that we're dealing with. For example, right now, the provision on sanctions and sanctions relief is the West will gradually loosen sanctions in proportion to Russia's compliance with the terms. Hold on a second. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
In proportion to Russia's compliance with the terms of the peace deal. Now, if you start to suggest to offer immediate sanctions relief, especially on the core areas that the Russians care about, transport, logistics, energy, the SWIFT banking system, the big baskets of sanctions, that I think very well could lead to Russian flexibility in other areas, in other points of this deal. And all of that has to be explored. It's not going to be explored by Thanksgiving. I think we can, get a better sense of how all of this will play out over the coming days. But we are dealing with a complex set of issues that will take potentially weeks, if not months, to fully unpack. But there is huge potential for compromise if we play our cards right with the Russians, while also moderating the more hardline positions that Ukraine has taken. Because if we take on board all of Ukraine's public-facing positions about we will never give up our right to join NATO, we refuse to accept any caps on our troops, we refuse to accept any territorial concessions, then we're back to square one, because the Russians at that point have no longer any reason to compromise. So that has to be taken into account. And so we're looking at a situation where we have to apply leverage in both directions. We have to have a serious, responsible dialogue with the Ukrainians about what they're willing to concede in order to end this war. That's not going to go better for them if it continues into 2026. And at the same time, we have to use the full extent of leverage we have with Russia to get to as close as we can to the minimum possible position that Russia will accept.
Right.
Did you want to add something? Yeah.
Well, I have a counter proposition to my original argument in terms of European cynicism and their actual objectives at this point. And to the most cynical among European leaders and elites, outcome would be a collapse in Ukraine and a defeat. Because in a perverse way, the larger the defeat, the more the fact of that defeat does two things. First of all, it totally empowers current European and EU elites so that they have more control over their very restive populations, because now there is an emergency. There is this massive defeat, and there is an active Cold War that must be pursued, a la what Germany is doing today with this notion of full rearmament. And a lot of the tub thumping that you see in Whitehall and 10 Downing Street, and the desire for Britain to have some misdirection or distraction from the civil conflicts that are bubbling over, not only in Britain, but Germany and France as well, Italy, Spain. And so a defeat allows that misdirection to be fulfilled. And at the same time, a defeat that makes Russia look bigger and badder than ever will, in a sense, also create a misdirection as to the culpability of Europe in creating this war and continuing it to the point of disaster, and also the various failings of European militaries to effectively assist Ukraine and to actually push them into offensive strategies that were substantially the undoing of the Ukrainian military in this war. There were at least 4 offensives in Kherson, in Kharkiv, Kharkov, I prefer, and Kursk, as well as Zaporizhia, the big counteroffensive. And they were like the offensives of the South in the Civil War. They just ground up the Ukrainian army again and again and again and again. And a lot of this was due to European and American management of the war. So the last thing that Europe wants now is to have to face up to defeat as their fault. And so if they can shift it so that Russia's the bogeyman again, then they'll at least be able to elide their full responsibility and the malign elements in that responsibility, but they'll also be able to gain more control over their electorates.
Right, but it's like a self-defeating strategy, because if you take that to the logical conclusion, they'll have to increase their defense outlays even more so than they are promising to today, because they will have a bigger hole, festering hole in Europe that they'll have to secure. And I don't think they have the money to do that. So I guess this leaves the Trump administration in a tight spot, because on one hand, it is aware of all of the fault lines and what these Europeans are doing. But on the other, it has to bring them in on some level on these negotiations. Like what can the Trump administration do to not completely carve the Europeans out of this process, but at the same time bring them in and in a positive direction to actually get things done. I don't know how they do that. Mark, do you have any thoughts on like the balancing act that the Trump administration faces right now in these negotiations?
Well, look, so this is a war unfolding on the European continent, the most destructive war in Europe since 1945, and we cannot uh, remove ourselves from the geography of that, from where this war is unfolding. At the same time, it's been made abundantly clear over the last several years, but especially over the past half year, that the Europeans have not a single constructive proposal for ending the war or for driving the negotiations forward. And to the extent that we engage the Europeans, and I think we have to engage them ultimately, they do have the capacity to sabotage or perhaps even sink any potential deal. But to the extent that we engage them, we have to be very clear on what our priorities are. We cannot be afraid of using the full weight of our leverage, including in other areas, by the way. For example, when it comes to tariff negotiations with the Europeans, I think there are interesting linkages here to be struck. It doesn't have to be only about Ukraine. For example, also, Europeans are very fearful of abandonment. That the United States is shifting its priorities to the Indo-Pacific, to the Western Hemisphere, and is increasingly winding down its presence. Well, one area of reassurance for the Europeans could be that if you play ball on these Ukraine negotiations, then we will commit to maintaining our force posture in Central Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of wheeling and dealing to be done, but we cannot uh, uh, ignore. We cannot be blind to the fact that we do have, in the form of the European Commission, the European leadership, and a number of European states, particularly in the north, the Scandinavian countries, Finland, a real initiative to not make it possible for the war to end on the terms in which it could possibly end. Now, do I think that the Europeans are committed to continuing the war forever in perpetuity? No, not necessarily. I do think the Europeans want to end this war without anything that can be perceived as a possible concession to Russia, which of course is not how it works. Russia has the momentum on the battlefield. If the war draws on, it will not go in Ukraine's favor. And so, yes, any realistic, viable proposal will include things that are positive, favorable to Russia. Not all. Russia is not going to get everything. And even the 28-point plan did not include everything Russia wanted.
Right.
But there are going to have to be some meaningful concessions to Russia. In one area, Kelly, where I think we should really put our foot down is on the issue of NATO expansion.
Yeah.
Not just Ukraine's NATO membership, but NATO expansion writ large. It's always been in America's interests to solve this open door issue, this issue of NATO's open door policy once and for all. And we now have an opportunity to do it as part of this peace deal that not only addresses the situation with Ukraine, but also sets expectations for the way that America engages on NATO's eastern flank going forward. And I really hope we seize this opportunity. But doing so will require difficult conversations with our European partners and creative models for how to get there, because we're not going to get a consensus within NATO, no matter how hard we push. We're not going to convince Estonians or Latvians to close NATO's open door. What we can do is have some kind of a coalition of willing NATO members, including Slovakia, Hungary, Turkey. I think we can enlist a whole bunch of Southern European states, maybe Italy, maybe even France, because Macron has been an interesting actor himself over in the past years. A coalition of willing NATO states to enter into an agreement with Russia, assuring that there will be no eastward expansion of NATO in exchange for no westward expansion of the CSTO, which is Russia's equivalent to NATO. It's a Russian-led military alliance. And this could be a formula for solving the NATO question as part of solving this war in a way that leads us to a more stable posture on NATO's eastern flank. So I hope we entertain these kinds of proposals. And I think, again, we have the leverage to get there, but it's about using the leverage in a smart, effective way.
Just to follow up on that, this highlights the fact that the real strategic conundrum is within the alliance and within the imperial court in Washington, that Russia is not the issue here in terms of reaching a settlement. And the third leg to this problem, of course, are the neocons and the I'm not even sure what role Mr. Rubio played in the coming apart of the 28-point plan. It seems as though he had some kind of intervention. It's hard because Europeans are one problem in terms of getting them on board, but how do you keep your own cause from being sabotaged by the neocons and the diehard,
the entire Washington establishment?
Yeah, and they want war among the Democrats. They are eager. They're champing at the bit. So this is a mentality that has seized elites across the Western world, and they want to fight. I mean, look at someone like Anne Applebaum, for example. This is somebody who would have been considered a peace-loving liberal 30 years ago or more, and she's now a war hawk. And they don't want to let go. So I don't know. My concern is that the emotions are so powerful, stoked by Russiagate and all sorts of other things in the domestic sphere, that I don't know that I think their emotions will cloud their ability to make good choices.
Right. So I guess this all goes back to the Trump administration and whether or not it has effectively distanced itself from that emotional, trap that has kept this from moving towards a diplomatic exit. And I think we all counted on Trump to do that because he was the most burned by Russiagate. So he's not under its spell the way the rest of the establishment is. We just have to wonder who in his orbit is calling the shots or guiding Trump through this process, and just hope that it's more J.D. Vance than Keith Kellogg, for example. I haven't heard a lot about Kellogg. We're hearing more about Dan Driscoll, who is old friend of J.D. Vance. So who knows? You bring up a good point with Rubio and where he stands. There's so much gossip going on. I'm not sure whether he's killing the plan or saving it from moment to moment. But, he has been known as a neocon and a hawk for most of his political career. He certainly is on Venezuela and Israel. So I guess it remains to be seen if who the better angels are in the administration, if they're able to guide Trump on that right path. So we've run out of time. I really appreciate both of you and these insights, and I know that my audience will as well. And I hope to have you back on soon.
Wonderful. Thank you.